Good evening. You might expect that royal women, adorned in luxurious gowns and using opulent drinking vessels, would regularly indulge in baths with fancy soaps and sponges. But no. In the time-honored tradition of historical contradiction, these women were among the least bath people in Europe. And it wasn't because they didn't have access to servants or basins or scented soaps. It was a conscious choice. Because back then, bathing wasn't just unnecessary. It was downright dangerous. Tonight, we're stepping into the unexpectedly foul world of royal hygiene. More precisely, the worst personal habits of royal women. The queens, the duchesses, the aristocratic ladies who wore silk, ruled empires, and often reeked like damp laundry and floral despair. But before we get too comfortable, go ahead and like the video, only if you genuinely enjoy this sort of thing. And drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from, and what time it is for you. It's always oddly comforting to know who else is falling asleep to mildly horrifying history. Now, dim the lights, maybe switch on a fan for that soft background hum, and settle in. But no. In the time-honored tradition of historical contradiction, these women were among the least bath people in Europe. And it wasn't because they didn't have access to servants or basins or scented soaps. It was a conscious choice. Because back then, bathing wasn't just unnecessary. It was downright dangerous. Now, you might assume, quite reasonably, that royalty, with their access to castles, servants, silver basins, and endless supplies of lavender and rosewater, would have embraced bathing as a regular, even luxurious routine. But in the grand tradition of aristocratic logic, the more resources they had to stay clean, the less they actually used them. Because back then, bathing wasn't seen as healthy. It wasn't refreshing. It wasn't even considered neutral. It was feared. According to the best minds of the time, which is to say, men in robes who also believed that menstruation caused crop failure, the act of immersing yourself in warm water was deeply dangerous. Heat, they insisted, opened the pores of the skin. And once those pores were open, anything, illness, sin, foul vapors, even demons, could slip right in. Your body, they believed, was safest when tightly sealed, like a fortress. And a hot bath was the equivalent of flinging open all the gates and inviting plague to come in and have a seat. So, for many noble women, the solution was simple and terrifyingly consistent. They just didn't bathe. At all. Take Queen Isabella of Castile. She ruled a vast empire, commissioned voyages across oceans, and reportedly took only 2 baths in her entire life. The first was on the day she was born. The second, on the day of her wedding. After that, her skin was considered permanently off-limits to water. Her body became a closed system, a monument to both piety and, presumably, fermentation. But for the occasional royal who did decide to brave a bath, the process was so inconvenient, so physically taxing and logistically absurd, that most only attempted it on rare occasions, coronations, diplomatic emergencies, or bouts of mysterious rash that could no longer be ignored. First, the tub. It wasn't the kind of pristine porcelain you're imagining, gently steaming beneath a chandelier. It was usually a deep wooden barrel, patched with iron hoops, that leaked slightly and smelled faintly of mildew and regret. Dragging it into the chamber required several footmen and at least one servant already on the verge of quitting. Then came the water. And here, the real torment began. Dozens of heavy buckets had to be filled downstairs in the kitchens or at the nearest well, carried up winding staircases, sloshed through corridors, and poured by hand into the tub, which, depending on your castle's plumbing situation, could take over an hour. The water was heated as best it could be, which meant that the first few buckets were scalding, the middle ones lukewarm, and the last ones increasingly cold and full of floating ash. By the time the tub was full, the water was no longer inviting. It was more of a dare. Even then, the royal woman did not bathe alone. This wasn't for romance or relaxation, but for modesty. There were attendants nearby to keep her from slipping, to hold her upright, to scrub discreetly at the parts she wasn't supposed to acknowledge. Nakedness was rare. Most women bathed in a thin linen shift that clung wet to their bodies and trapped the very dirt they had hoped to remove. And then there was the water itself, which was never changed. If another family member was waiting to use the tub, they simply climbed in next. The order was strictly based on rank. The queen went first. Everyone else followed. And if you happened to be third or fourth in line, well, by that point, the bath was less a cleansing ritual and more a cautious immersion into someone else's biological legacy. But for most royal women, all of that, the buckets, the servants, the heat, the embarrassment, was too much effort for too little reward. So instead, they turned to what became the most popular cleaning method in royal courts, the dry rub. Take a clean piece of linen, preferably embroidered, if you're of high enough status, and vigorously wipe down your skin. No water. No soap. Just friction and hope. The goal was not to cleanse, but to remove the top layer of grime. A sort of surface exorcism. This method was known, unofficially, as wipe and hope. And hope was doing most of the work. Of course, wiping wasn't enough to eliminate the smell of a human body that hadn't touched water in weeks. So to finish the routine, if we can call it that, royal women turned to perfume. Not a delicate spritz behind the ear. Not a gentle dab on the wrist. But full-scale olfactory warfare. They drenched themselves in floral oils, crushed herbs, tinctures made with musk and ambergris and substances so strong they could probably qualify as a weapon in close quarters. Perfume wasn't a finishing touch. It was a disguise. A thick, aggressive cloud designed not to smell good, but to smell stronger than whatever was rotting underneath. It worked, more or less. The scent of jasmine and violet may have lingered in the air, but beneath it, the truth remained. Because no matter how many herbs were sewn into their gowns, how many scented pomanders dangled from their belts, or how many gallons of rose water they poured into their wigs, they still hadn't bathed. And no one was going to say it. Now, if you're wondering whether all that perfume, the oils, the powders, the scented gloves and violently floral gowns, was ever about smelling good, the answer is no. Not really. It was never about cleanliness. It wasn't even about comfort. It was about control. Because in royal courts, where everything, from how you walked to how you blinked, was judged as a symbol of status, your scent became part of your performance. And royal women understood this better than anyone. If you couldn't bathe regularly, and you weren't supposed to, and your gowns were absorbing every human secretion like a velvet sponge, which they were, then the only way to project power was to project smell. Strongly. Aggressively. Strategically. Perfume became a kind of olfactory armor, an invisible veil of dominance and denial. It didn't matter if your body was fermenting under 4 layers of brocade. What mattered was that you smelled like someone who had never even heard of sweat. Or hunger. Or pause. And this wasn't just a dab of rose water behind the ears. This was full body saturation. Perfume was massaged into the skin, soaked into gloves, rubbed into the lining of gowns, and sprayed into wigs that already smelled like starch, mouse droppings, and last week's floral tragedy. Entire chairs were perfumed. Curtains were perfumed. Fans, letters, bedsheets. Even pets. If it could hold a smell, it was weaponized. Sitting down in a duchess's salon might leave you smelling like crushed violet and despair for the rest of the week, whether you wanted to or not. Some scents were so strong that guests fainted. Others simply developed migraines, quietly reassured that this level of sensory assault meant they were indeed in the presence of royalty. And royalty, by definition, did not smell human. And the ingredients? Absolutely revolting. Let's start with ambergris. It sounds elegant. It was not. Ambergris is a waxy, grayish substance found floating in the ocean, expelled from the intestines of sperm whales, essentially, marine vomit. But to the royal nose, it was divine. It fixed the scent of floral oils, made them last longer, and lent a mysterious musky undertone that said, I have power. And possibly access to very cooperative whales. Another favorite? Musk, a secretion scraped from the scent glands of male deer. When mixed with rose or lavender, it added a deep, earthy base note. When used alone, it made you smell like a well-dressed forest accident. Queen Marie Antoinette, always the overachiever of aesthetics, had a personal perfumer, not a hobbyist, not an assistant, but a full-time court position, dedicated entirely to creating custom fragrances for her every mood and event. There was morning perfume, garden perfume, perfume for tea, perfume for horseback riding, perfume for dying nobly under public scrutiny. All tailored, all floral, all terrifyingly strong. Some women carried scented handkerchiefs, which they pressed discreetly to their faces when someone less perfumed, which was everyone, entered the room. Others used pomanders, small, ornate orbs filled with dried herbs and resins, which dangled from their belts or were clutched like fashionable gas masks. The most desperate carried vinaigrettes, little lockets filled with vinegar-soaked sponges, which could be held under the nose like a subtle cry for help. And yet, none of this was considered excessive. It was elegant, sophisticated, expected. Because to smell like jasmine and ambergris was to smell like money, and, more importantly, like distance. If your scent entered the room before you did, and lingered long after you'd gone, it sent a clear message. I am not like you. I do not need to sweat. I do not need to clean. I am another person. I am elevated. I am royal. Of course, the reality was that beneath the violet mist and powdered gloves, they still smelled. But the illusion was airtight. Because in royal courts, illusion mattered more than health. And perfume, weaponized, suffocating, and rich with whale guts, was the final line of defense. If you've been picturing royal women with long, flowing hair cascading over perfumed shoulders, I'm afraid I have disappointing news. Because by the 17th and 18th centuries, growing your own hair was considered vulgar, or worse, practical. Hair was something the body made, and anything the body made was deeply suspicious. So, naturally, the solution was to replace it with something enormous, powdered, and entirely unclean. Enter the wig. Not a discreet little poof, but full-scale architectural feats. Some stood over a foot tall. Others were adorned with silk flowers, velvet bows, gilded combs, and in a few spectacular cases, entire miniature ships with rigging and sails. Yes, somewhere in Versailles, there was a duchess attending a formal dinner with a naval reenactment teetering on her head. And you might assume, again, reasonably, that if a wig is perched 3 feet above your eyes, full of flower, feathers, and ambition, someone would occasionally clean it. But no. Royal wigs were rarely, if ever, washed. They were powdered, fluffed, adjusted, and sprayed with perfume. But soap and water? Unthinkable. These wigs were delicate. They were expensive. They were full of secrets. And unfortunately, they were also full of life. The powder used to whiten and style them, often made of flour, starch, or even animal fat, created the perfect warm, sticky, undisturbed paradise for lice. And not just one or two. Wigs became bustling, upscale neighborhoods for insects. A 5-star resort for parasites. And yet, instead of treating the infestation, women adapted. They used something called a louse stick, a long, thin rod, often made of ivory or gold, used to discreetly scratch the scalp beneath the wig without appearing uncivilized. These sticks were kept in sleeves, disguised as hairpins or jewelry, and used during conversation, court appearances, even church. One hand gestured elegantly. The other performed pest control. The technique mattered. Too frantic, and you looked desperate. Too slow, and the itching won. The ideal scratch was graceful, thoughtful, like you were pondering a diplomatic alliance, not stabbing a bug behind your ear. But lice weren't the only problem. Because powdered wigs, soaked in oil, fat, starch, and scented powders, also attracted something with fur. And teeth. Mice. Tiny, whiskered opportunists with an excellent sense of smell and a complete disregard for court protocol. To a mouse, a royal wig wasn't a hairstyle. It was real estate. It was warmth, food, insulation, and shelter, all perched safely on a sleeping noblewoman's head. There are documented accounts, whispered and horrified, of mice nesting in wigs overnight. Of royal ladies waking up not to the rustle of silk or the chirp of birds, but to the soft scratch of tiny claws repositioning themselves beneath a powdered bow. Some didn't notice until morning. Others were betrayed mid-conversation, when a twitch or a squeak interrupted their monologue on lace tariffs. And so, royal women, in a completely normal, entirely rational act of self-preservation, began wearing wig cages to bed. These were not metaphors. They were real. Small wire enclosures worn over the head while sleeping, designed to keep rodents from turning your hairstyle into a maternity ward. Imagine that. You're the Queen of France. You own palaces, diamonds, and entire colonies. And every night before bed, you strap a metal cage to your skull. Because mice think your hair is a bakery. And yet, the wigs remained. They were still powdered. Still perfumed. Still carefully arranged to signal wealth, status, and detachment from the common suffering of the human body. Because if you had a ship on your head and a mouse in your wig but still looked beautiful by candlelight, that was power. Not clean. Not practical. But unmistakably powerful. So the next time your hair's a little frizzy, or your conditioner runs out, just remember. At least you're not sleeping with scaffolding on your scalp, or waking up to find your curls redecorated by rodents. If the wigs didn't get you, the face paint probably would. Because in the royal courts of Europe, beauty wasn't just a goal. It was a performance. And the ideal face, the one considered truly noble, truly refined, was pale, smooth, poreless, and utterly lifeless. It had to glow with an otherworldly stillness, untouched by sun, effort, or biology. Which meant that if your cheeks had color, or your skin had texture, or your eyebrows grew naturally in the direction God intended, you had already failed. So the solution, again, was poison. The most fashionable royal women achieved their glowing, porcelain complexions not through rest or skincare or inner peace, but by smearing lead on their faces. The mixture was called Venetian ceruse, a creamy white paste made by combining white lead with vinegar, aged to a smooth consistency and sold in tiny jars like luxurious death. It was applied daily to the face, neck, chest, and sometimes even the hands, and it created a soft, luminous finish that glowed in candlelight, and under no other conditions. It also happened to slowly destroy the very skin it was meant to perfect. Women developed peeling, cracking, blistering rashes. Their hair began to fall out. Open sores formed where the paste was applied. And yet, they kept using it. Because to stop meant revealing what lay beneath. And in court life, being visibly human was not an option. Of course, once the damage set in, it had to be covered with more ceruse. And then more. And more. It became a cycle of decay and denial. The more the skin deteriorated, the more makeup was required to hide it, which caused more deterioration, which meant thicker layers of poison, until eventually, the face underneath resembled something more wax sculpture than woman. But it didn't stop there. A fully adorned royal face required rouge, usually made with mercury salts, which gave the cheeks a flush of life, and the blood, a cocktail of confusion. And if the ceruse and mercury hadn't finished the job, there was always belladonna, an extract from deadly nightshade used to dilate the pupils, giving the eyes a glassy, dough-like appearance, or the look of someone who had recently been poisoned. Which, to be fair, they had. Now, of course, all of this created additional problems. The sores. The scabs. The discoloration. The places where skin simply gave up. And for that, there was a solution too: beauty marks. Not freckles. Not natural moles. These were small patches made of velvet, silk, or, if you were feeling particularly dramatic, mouse fur. Yes, real fur, plucked from real rodents, then cut into tiny shapes and glued onto the face. They were called mouches, French for flies, and were placed strategically to convey certain messages. A beauty mark near the mouth meant flirtation. One near the eye meant passion. On the cheek, boldness. On the chin, elegance. Over a sore? A secret. Some women wore just one. Others wore several. Some faces were covered like constellations, an entire emotional vocabulary painted in mouse and glue. And still, none of this was considered ridiculous. It was art. It was status. It was survival. Because if your skin was falling off from daily lead exposure, and your blood was humming with mercury, and your eyebrows had been plucked into extinction, but your face still glowed beneath the chandeliers, then you were winning. Never mind that you couldn't sweat, or blink comfortably, or feel your lips. What mattered was that no one saw the damage, and that the illusion held. Because in the court of appearances, decay was acceptable, as long as it looked beautiful while it rotted. At this point, you may be thinking, surely, all those layers of fabric, the corsets, the gowns, the towering wigs, the perfumes and powders, all of that must have been sitting atop something. Some modest barrier of linen. A pair of silk drawers, perhaps. Or even a humble underpant, stitched by hand and changed every now and again. And you would be wrong. Spectacularly wrong. Because for much of history, especially in Europe's most extravagant courts, royal women did not wear underwear. Not because they didn't have the technology. Not because they couldn't afford it. But because underpants, in any form, were considered either too masculine, too vulgar, or suspiciously French. That is right. Breeches were for men. Loose drawers were for peasants. And a noblewoman, a lady of status, grace, and powdered denial, was expected to exist somewhere between angel and statue. Untouched. Untouchable. And definitely not wearing anything that resembled logic or cotton. Now, to be fair, most royal women did wear a linen chemise, a basic shift or smock worn beneath the gown, intended to absorb the worst of the body's inconvenient functions. But beneath that? Nothing. Just skin. Possibly some perfume. And the overwhelming weight of ceremonial responsibility. Which leads us to an important and often overlooked question. What happened when nature called? Because let's be honest, no matter how royal you are, biology doesn't pause for etiquette. So picture this, you're wearing a corset laced tight enough to compress your spine. A gown that weighs as much as a toddler. Overskirts, underskirts, embroidered petticoats, and a hoop structure so wide it knocks over furniture when you walk. You haven't bathed in 3 weeks. You're sealed into 30 pounds of unwashed velvet. And now you have to pee. You don't remove the dress. That would take an hour and at least 3 people. You don't squat, because your knees are immobilized by layers of brocade and ceremonial pride. So what do? You hover. You balance yourself. You trust in your thighs and your maid. And sometimes, you improvise. Enter the bordelu, a small, gravy boat-shaped chamber pot designed specifically for noble women to use discreetly, often while seated, dressed, or mid-conversation. It was slipped beneath the gown, held in place with practiced precision, and quietly relieved into, all without disrupting the folds of silk or the cadence of a diplomatic discussion. There are letters, actual historical letters, describing royal women using these devices in court, during banquets, even in carriages en route to formal events, managing bodily functions with the same elegance and secrecy with which they managed political intrigue. But even with such innovations, the system was far from clean. The linen shifts, which bore the brunt of daily wear, were rarely washed. They were expensive to launder, time-consuming to boil and scrub, and nobody, not even the most loyal servant, was thrilled to handle a queen's underlayer of fermented despair. And so they were reused, aired out, perfumed, folded neatly and returned to the pile of things that smelled like jasmine and inevitability. When underpants finally did appear in aristocratic wardrobes, in the late 1700s and early 1800s, they were viewed with deep suspicion. Too French. Too practical. Too intimate. Some considered them scandalous, a sign of looseness, of accessibility, of acknowledging that women's bodies did things other than exist beautifully in candlelight. Others saw them as a working-class invention. Useful, yes, but vulgar. Because what could possibly be more threatening to noble mystique than admitting that under all those layers of silk, there was a human woman, wearing pants? So instead, they continued to go without. No elastic. No waistband. Just linen, lace, a little divine right, and sheer determination. Because in the royal court, modesty didn't mean coverage. It meant illusion. And comfort, as always, was sacrificed on the altar of spectacle. If you've made it this far, you may be thinking, surely, after all the rot, the rodents, and the relentless perfume, at least their clothing, regal and shimmering as it was, offered some small measure of comfort. But no. Because royal fashion, like so many things in court life, wasn't designed for the body. It was designed for the room. For the gaze. For the statement it made, not the skin it touched. And what it touched, often suffered. Let's begin with the fabric itself. Royal gowns were made from the finest materials money and empire could procure. Silks imported from Asia, velvets dyed in crushed insects, lace stiffened with starches that would make a chemist wince. The colors were radiant, blood reds, deep sapphires, shimmering golds, each shade a coded signal of wealth, power, and piety. But achieving those colors was its own small horror. Many of the dyes were stabilized with arsenic or mercury, blended into the fibers to make them hold their brightness longer under candlelight. Others were cut with lead or copper salts, absorbed directly through the skin over time. Blue gowns, in particular, were notorious for causing rashes and dizziness, while certain reds burned the skin if worn for too long in the sun. Fashion, in these circles, was not seasonal. It was chemical warfare. And then there was the lace, delicate, yes, but starched to architectural rigidity using waxes that sometimes included animal fats, lead-based powders, or resin scraped from old wood. The effect was stunning. Until it rubbed your neck raw during a royal reception. Or left your collarbone covered in welts. Even fur, which seems like it should have been the cozy exception, came with its own set of challenges. Royal garments were often lined with squirrel, ermine, or fox, but not all of it was properly cured. And so, under the warmth of a ballroom, the fur began to shed. Not delicately, not tastefully, but all at once, into sleeves, into bodices, into the sweaty creases of corsets already doing their best to suffocate the wearer. And speaking of corsets, these were not the romantic hourglass lace-ups you've seen in films. These were instruments of compression. Stiffened with whalebone, wood, or in some cases even metal plates, royal corsets were designed to reduce the torso into a fashionable silhouette, regardless of how the lungs or liver felt about it. They cut into the ribs. They left deep impressions along the waist. And for women with sensitive skin or pre-existing illness, they could trigger eczema, shallow breathing, or fainting spells that were dismissed as graceful delicacy rather than intermittent organ failure. But that wasn't the end of it. Because then came the jewelry. Necklaces of pearls. Chains of gold. Earrings, brooches, hairpins. Gorgeous to look at, and occasionally toxic to wear. Copper, commonly used as a base metal, would turn the skin green, staining the neck like a bruise. Lead-based glazes on gemstones were common. And ear piercings became infected so frequently that some women resorted to gluing their jewelry on with tree sap or fish paste. The smell alone must have been spectacular. And just when you think it can't get worse, there were the layers. Endless layers. Dresses were sewn onto the body in some cases, quite literally stitched to the chemise underneath. Not symbolically. Not metaphorically. With a needle and thread. Why? To maintain a perfect fit, to hide the fastening, or simply to keep everything in place for long events. This meant that if a woman began to swell, due to heat, illness, allergic reaction, or pregnancy, she didn't remove the garment. She endured it. Until the end of the event, or until the seams split. Whichever came first. And of course, there was no ventilation. Modern fabrics wick moisture, breathe, stretch. Royal garments did none of these things. In summer, they became mobile ovens. In winter, they trapped sweat beneath velvet and fur. The skin beneath these outfits wasn't protected. It was marinated, in perfume, in heat, in anxiety, and in whatever soap substitute had been applied 3 weeks earlier. So while peasants worried about hunger, mud, and disease, royal women were quietly battling textile-induced trauma. A dress that looked like moonlight from afar could, up close, be stitched with toxins. A necklace that shimmered with rubies might be turning the chest beneath it green. And a corset that held perfect posture for a portrait might also be bruising the lungs of the woman inside it. But it didn't matter. Because the goal wasn't health. It wasn't ease. It wasn't even survival. It was a spectacle. It was about image. It was the ruthless illusion that nobility looked effortless, even when the effort left scars. So the next time you pull at a tag on your sweater or feel annoyed by the waistband of your leggings, remember this. Once upon a time, somewhere, in a very cold castle, a royal woman was being sewn into a poisonous dress. Lined with molting fur. Squeezed into bone armor. Drenched in ambergris. And smiling, just faintly. For the portrait painter. Because in her world, to suffer silently, and make it look divine, was the highest form of fashion. Before we move on, let's take a moment to talk about something royal portraits never showed. Not the gowns, not the jewels, not even the famous powdered faces. But what was happening just behind the lips. Because when it came to dental hygiene, royal women weren't just suffering silently. They were rotting quietly, one elegant molar at a time. If eyes were the windows to the soul, then mouths were the trapdoors to quiet, festering panic. And in the royal courts of early modern Europe, you didn't have to look far to find decay, you only had to listen closely when someone with a crown tried to say the word ambassador. Because behind every tight-lipped smile, beneath every pearl-lined fan and closed-mouth portrait, was a dental situation so dire, so quietly revolting, that it was practically its own category of royal suffering. Let's begin with the sweet part. Literally. By the 16th century, sugar had arrived in European courts, and it did not go unnoticed. Royal women embraced it not as a seasoning or an occasional indulgence, but as a lifestyle. Sugar meant wealth. Sugar meant access. Sugar meant you were rich enough to eat things that didn't actually need to be sweetened, and do it anyway. There were candied violets and glazed fruits, sweetened wines, almond pastes, honeyed sauces, and pastry stacked like edible architecture. Cakes soaked in syrup. Fish glazed in sugar. Pork cooked with prunes and honey and saffron. There were even sugar sculptures, animals, castles, saints, carved for display and sometimes eaten afterward, usually when no one was looking. The result? A court full of elegant women with rotting mouths. Teeth blackened. Molars crumbled. Gums swelled and bled. Abscesses formed quietly, throbbing beneath layers of powder and pride. Some women developed such severe dental infections that they could no longer chew, not because of the pain alone, but because they had so few teeth left to do it with. And yet, they kept eating sugar. Because to say no to sweetness was to say no to status. So, instead of adapting their diet, they adapted their dinner. Royal kitchens began preparing soft foods for those whose mouths could no longer participate in normal chewing. Everything was softened, mashed, soaked, stewed. Porridge. Custards. Sweet soups. Pulps of fruit and meat blended into silky, toothless mixtures. It was a royal banquet, reimagined as one long, elegant bowl of mush. And when the time came to address the damage, to pull the offending tooth or relieve the abscess, the task didn't fall to a doctor or a trained medical professional. It fell to the barber. Yes. the same man who trimmed beards and curled wigs. He also removed teeth. Using forceps, with no anesthetic and in the presence of witnesses. Tooth pulling was swift, brutal, and unapologetic. The patient would be restrained, their head tilted back, and the barber would extract the decaying tooth, or sometimes all of them, in a single, wrenching gesture. It was noisy, bloody, unsterile, and astonishingly common. Afterward, there were herbal rinses, honey wine. Sometimes, women chewed on cloves or cinnamon bark to ease the pain, or at least mask the smell. But nothing truly solved the problem. Early attempts at tooth powders were only slightly less horrifying than the condition they tried to cure. Mixtures included ground oyster shells, burned animal bones, powdered charcoal, and sometimes even brick dust, all rubbed directly onto inflamed gums with a cloth. It scraped. It bled. It did not restore the enamel. And so, royal women learned to keep their mouths closed. Literally. Portraits from the period show tight lips, downturned expressions, the kind of gentle repose that looks like mystery, but might actually be jaw pain. Smiling with teeth was considered inappropriate for noble women anyway. That was for peasants, children, and people with teeth worth showing. In court, a true lady smiled softly, without parting her lips. If she laughed too openly, someone might see the damage. Or smell it. Queen Elizabeth I, one of the most powerful monarchs in English history, became known in her later years for delivering speeches that no one could quite understand. Foreign ambassadors wrote reports noting the strange quality of her voice, the garbled vowels, the slurred consonants. She was, quite possibly, delivering state policy through a mouth that had collapsed. But no one dared say it. Because in a world obsessed with appearance, a royal woman's mouth had to remain composed, even as it betrayed her one root at a time. So they powdered their cheeks, painted their lips, chewed herbs, drank wine, smiled carefully, and spoke in whispers. And if they could no longer chew, they had to feed themselves by sipping. They spooned. They swallowed delicately. Because nothing, not even exposed nerve endings, was allowed to interrupt the illusion of grace. Of all the natural functions royal women had to navigate back then, none was more feared, or more quietly catastrophic, than menstruation. It was not discussed. It was not acknowledged. It was certainly not allowed to exist in public. And yet, every month, it arrived anyway, beneath the corsets, under the powdered wigs, right through the brocade. There were no pads. No tampons. No private bathrooms. What they had was softened linen rags, folded and tied to a belt beneath the gown, a makeshift napkin held together with hope and discretion. Sometimes sponges were used. Occasionally moss. Some women reportedly carried small pouches of dried herbs to soothe the discomfort. Others just clenched their jaws and got through the day. Privacy was non-existent. Royal women were constantly surrounded, by maids, by advisors, by ladies-in-waiting. If something slipped, if the linen shifted, if even a drop escaped onto a chair or a cushion, it wasn't just a stain. It was a scandal. A missed period meant gossip. Pregnancy. Succession rumors. A sign of fertility, or the threat of illegitimacy. A period that arrived at the wrong time, in the wrong place, or with the wrong volume could destroy alliances. It could even end a queen's influence. And through it all, they had to remain calm. Serene. Unbothered. Some suffered from dizziness, cramps, or fainting spells, described, of course, as delicacy. If a woman was pale and breathless, it wasn't menstrual pain. It was a personal charm. Or nerves. Or divine mystery. Meanwhile, church law often barred menstruating women from touching sacred objects, attending mass, or entering consecrated space. They were, for those few days, considered ritually impure, not just tired or sore, but spiritually suspect. No relief. No comfort. And absolutely no room for error. Because if royal hygiene was built on illusion, then bleeding was the one truth that could never be allowed to show. Let's talk about clothes. Again. Not the gowns themselves, we've covered the sequin trauma. But what happened after they were worn? Because royal garments, silk, velvet, fur, lace, were rarely, if ever, washed. Water ruined the dyes. Soap damaged the embroidery. Scrubbing could tear the fabric. So instead, they were aired out. Draped near windows. Brushed down gently with soft tools. Spritzed with perfume until the scent of skin and old soup was faintly disguised by rose water and denial. Undergarments, the linen shifts and chemises that sat closest to the body, were sometimes washable. But even those were cleaned sparingly. Why? Because laundry, in a palace, was hell. It meant dragging baskets of royal linens to a water source. Boiling them in cauldrons. Beating them with wooden paddles. Drying them flat with heavy irons heated by fire. And folding them precisely under threat of social execution. The job was so loathed that it became its own corner of palace hierarchy. A sort of punishment tier. If you'd annoyed the wrong lady or made one too many mistakes, you might find yourself hand-washing a duchess's unmentionables with fingers that had never been thanked. And what about the clothes that got too stained to save? They were handed down. From queen to lady-in-waiting. From noblewoman to maid. A slow descent of sweat-soaked silk, perfumed decay, and hidden wine stains, passed lovingly along the social ladder. And then there was Empress Josephine, wife of Napoleon, who reportedly changed gowns several times a day, not because they were clean, but because she refused to wear the same filthy dress twice. The old gowns piled up, and servants were left to figure out what to do with a room full of scented, shimmering laundry no one wanted to touch. Because in a world where washing clothes required a small army and a great deal of emotional detachment, the best hygiene was still just the appearance of it. And sometimes, just barely. As we reach the end of this quietly horrifying journey through royal hygiene, it becomes clear that the goal was never cleanliness in the way we understand it today. It wasn't about eliminating germs, preventing illness, or even achieving comfort. It wasn't about health. It was about appearances, about performing a role so convincingly that no one dared look beneath the velvet, or the wig, or the heavily powdered skin. Cleanliness, in royal courts, was not something you did. It was something you looked like you had. And perhaps that's the part that lands the hardest, the realization that for centuries, the most powerful women in Europe weren't afforded even the most basic physical ease. They were draped in prestige and suffocated in discomfort. Their hair was removed, their skin burned, their organs compressed, and their dignity quietly compromised every time they had to hover above a porcelain pot in a gown stitched to their own chemise. All of it, the lead-based makeup, the whale vomit perfume, the ritualized non-bathing, served one function: to preserve the illusion of control, purity, and divine right. Today, we know things they didn't. We understand bacteria, the importance of hand washing, and how infection spreads. We know that bathing doesn't open the door to demons, and that skin needs air, not arsenic. We've invented shampoos, moisturizers, fluoride toothpaste, and fabrics that breathe. We've even built toilets that clean you, dry you, and play ambient forest sounds while they do it. Some of them, in Japan, even bow before you flush. And yet, the desire to present perfection, to conceal the mess of being human, hasn't gone anywhere. We no longer powder over smallpox scars with mouse fur patches, but we do filter our faces into oblivion. We no longer bathe in perfume to mask decay, but we still spritz ourselves before a date, hoping to project something soft, floral, and entirely curated. We have more comfort and more knowledge than any queen of the 18th century could have imagined, and yet, even with heated bidets and pH-balanced soap, we still feel pressure to be effortless. To be polished. To be, somehow, above it all. But at least we get to clean ourselves along the way. And that simple, wet, soapy reality, would have stunned a royal woman more than any jewel in her crown. Because the real luxury, in the end, wasn't perfume, or powdered wigs, or embroidered gowns stitched to your skin. The real luxury was ease. Was privacy. Was hygiene without performance. So the next time you step into a warm shower, or open a fresh toothbrush, or sit on a toilet that doesn't involve corset acrobatics and chamber pot logistics, just take a moment. You're living a kind of quiet, modern royalty. And the best part? You probably don't smell like ambergris. If you're still awake, and your mind hasn't wandered too far into the powdered wigs and perfumed panic of royal bedrooms long gone, then I hope this story gave your thoughts something quiet to rest against. It's strange to think that for all their power, their riches, their palaces, and paintings, royal women spent their lives wrapped in discomfort, unable to wash freely or even breathe easily in their own clothes. And yet here we are, tucked into our beds, bathed, brushed, and blessed with modern plumbing. Maybe that's the greatest irony of all. That comfort, in the end, didn't belong to queens. So sleep softly tonight, knowing that you, dear listener, live in a world where toilets flush, soap lathers, and no one has stitched your outfit to your body. You are clean. You are free. You are quietly victorious. Thank you for spending this time with me. And if you ever need another strange and soothing story to drift off to, you know where to find me. Good night. Written by Clara Finch, because some stories still deserve a soul.